Hi there, this is Paul Glumaz once again, and today is the 5th of July. We have just passed through the 244th anniversary of the founding of the United States of America. And we have a refounding process starting to go on in the context of the crisis. You have Trump's speech from Friday, from Friday at Mount Rushmore. But before I get into that, this is being brought to you by General Welfare Presents, and I'm Paul Glumaz, veteran with the LaRouche movement. And we have a refounding of the United States and its fundamental principles starting to occur. And you can see that in the speech of Donald Trump in front of the Rushmore monument, which is being viciously and all-out assault on Trump for giving that speech. Because in the speech, he began to connect the creation of the United States in 1776 with the fight against slavery. And that it was this process that began in 1776 and in the founding of America that actually was the cause ultimately of the defeat of slavery. This is very, very important. And that those principles are under attack. The foundational principles of this country are under attack by a he didn't say this, but by a entity that wants to destroy this country, and that entity is the British. It's always been the British, and they're deploying, as I laid out in the previous episode, many decades of false history about this founding principle and the foundational principle. And I encourage people to reflect upon that presentation, because it is coming in the context of something else, which Lyndon LaRouche always talked about. And that is, as we go into this crisis, the economic crisis, the civilizational crisis, the loss of credibility of the institutions, of the current institutions, there would be, and there is now occurring, something that Lyndon LaRouche predicted, which he called the Franklin Delano Roosevelt reflex. And that's what is now starting to take shape. And that's indicated to some degree in Lyndon LaRouche's, it's indicated in some degree implicitly in the foundational principles of the United States. Now, I'm going to start with the Lyndon LaRouche, some history of Lyndon LaRouche and how this came to be. Between 1945 and 46, Lyndon LaRouche was in Calcutta. He saw the opportunity for the Indians to overthrow the British, but they didn't, because they didn't have a program and they didn't have a unification around a program. And in that period, there was the death of FDR. And when LaRouche was asked by people what was his opinion of the death of FDR, he said, "We have lost a great man, and he's being replaced by a very little man." And that very little man began to reverse the policies of FDR. The post-war policies increasingly took a coloration that was not in the intention of what FDR had for the post-war period, post-World War II period. FDR made it very clear to Winston Churchill that he would work with Stalin to decolonialize the world and implement massive development, and that the industrial machine built up during the war would be unleashed to create development in all of Africa, Latin America, and so forth, and that this would also assist the development and reconstruction of Europe. Only that did not happen. Only parts of Europe were reconstructed. The Cold War got underway, and that shaped the world for the following 45 years or so. And in that context, the empire was able to come back and break apart all of the economic and financial structures FDR tried to set up for the post-war period. And so from 1971, when we went into the floating exchange system and FDR system of the Bretton Woods had been destroyed, that is when Lyndon LaRouche began to emerge as a return to FDR. And LaRouche's political movement, and LaRouche himself especially, has been an unwavering effort to return to FDR. And he had a crisis because in that period of the 60s, there were no people really interested in doing that. He had to go in, he had to dip into the counter-revolution, that the revolution, the rock, drug, sex counter-revolution, and the student unrest of the 60s to recruit the few cadre who would continue on and break with the intention of the British and others to use the remains of the people that went through the process of the Vietnam War and the hatred of America to create the current neoliberal system. You know, the people that were in SDS, the people that were in college, who participated in the rock, drug, sex counterculture and the anti-Americanism, they would then become, in the future, now they're the boomers, and they're the future heads of institutions, heads of corporations, and so forth. And LaRouche knew that their orientation would be very destructive. So he intervened and created a different cadre of people, cadre of young from that group, of which I was part, that would revive in the crisis the FDR perspective. And he was always saying the FDR reflex is still in the population. In the 1980s, when LaRouche started running for president, he was running as the ghost of FDR in the current situation. It was always that. It was always, he was running with the kind of economic policies that FDR would have represented. And in the early 80s, in 1980 actually exactly, a group was formed, or a political action committee was formed, called the Democratic Policy Committee. It was explicitly FDR oriented, and this was intervened in the Democratic Party in a very big way in the 80s, and it formed a policy orientation to keep alive the FDR tradition, not only in the Democratic Party, but with the intention of bringing back the FDR tradition in a crisis. And that Democratic Policy Committee at one point had hundreds of thousands of members. It was huge. And it reached its peak in 87 when the government seized it and shut it down. It shut down the newspaper associated with it, the New Solidarity, and shut it down. It was a government intervention, illegal government intervention, in 1987. And this was preceded by the victory in Illinois in the 1986 election for lieutenant governor and Secretary of State. This is when the LaRouche movement and the National Democratic Policy Committee had reached a tremendous saturation in the U.S. population, and then the boot came down. Okay, it was really millions of words, thousands of articles, media attacks on LaRouche, slanders, everything. It was a total all-out assault, and LaRouche narrowly missed being assassinated. Ronald Reagan had to intervene to stop the assassination. So this is something that people need to know. Now, similarly, this same dialogue has been going on for 40 years with diplomats, many of whom are now in leading positions. So it's not like the FDR tradition died because the policymakers rejected the FDR tradition and went with the globalized free trade and floating exchange system and all of that. No, it didn't die. It was the LaRouche movement is the movement that kept it alive. Now, so what is the FDR reflex? Okay, Xi Jinping, the president of China, said that his study of America is based on his study of three presidents: George Washington, Lincoln, and Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And China has been going through a lot of changes, but what has emerged in China is actually a presidential system. And you have to understand that in the original founding of the United States, the creation of a presidential system was a revolutionary act, with, of course, checks and balances. And it's precisely that institution of the presidency that's been massively undermined at this point, particularly since Trump was elected, or since Obama was elected, or since Bush was elected, George Jr. Now, Putin has been referring continuously to Franklin Delano Roosevelt as the model for his institution. But what most people don't know is that when LaRouche got out of prison, he was allowed to go to Russia to begin a dialogue with the leading Academy of Science people and leading people on the question of how Russia should establish an institution of the presidency. So the institution of the presidency is inseparable from the FDR reflex, because you can't implement FDR's policy without an institution like that the United States has had, and hopefully will soon have again. So that's the FDR reflex. De Gaulle reflected some of this in his attempt to establish the Fifth Republic in 1958. And de Gaulle represented something like an FDR tradition, although he didn't like FDR. Now, something very profound has occurred in this regard. There are certain elements in the British scene which have emerged. Jeremy Corbyn, the former Labour Party leader, was an FDR old socialist Labour, but he was unfortunately trapped in this green and identity politics and all of that. But he was campaigning for that, and he got viciously attacked. But Boris Johnson co-opted that aspect of Jeremy Corbyn in order to get elected, in order to win the parliamentary majority and go in. And last Tuesday, I believe it was the 28th of June, he announced that the United Kingdom was going all out with FDR, that it was build, build, build. There's no way to deal with the crisis, the COVID-19 crisis, or any of these other crises, except to build, 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 build. And this is very important because this is the FDR reflex manifesting itself in the United Kingdom. Keep in mind that the United Kingdom is not the empire. It's a component of the empire, but it itself is not the empire. The empire is much bigger. The empire is really basically a monetary system controlled by the City of London and Wall Street. And wars and division to keep nations from ganging up and crushing the empire and creating a Bretton Woods, or creating a monetary system, a credit system, where nations could actually have the power to emit credit to develop, and don't need to be having to go to a monetary system. A monetary system is a form of slavery, and that's part of the problem. You're a slave to the monetary system. You're a slave to the debt of the system. The debt you create is not being used to develop your nation. It's not being used to create infrastructure. Okay, so you're going deeper into debt, but you're not creating anything with it that has long-term value, and therefore you are sinking into debt slavery, and that's essentially what's been happening to every country, and the imposing of the European Union on Europe, and so forth. Now, the problem with the Chinese is they were able, because they were big and they were able to maintain a Hamiltonian system, or a credit system internally, and they were able to turn that to their advantage, to be able to use that internally to trade. But they can't. But they're trying to fit their non-monetary system in with an international monetary system, and that's creating a lot of issues that have to be resolved. And it can only be resolved when Trump brings China and Russia and India and maybe Japan into a summit where a new system is created, a new credit system is created, like was intended by FDR. So that's also part of the FDR reflex, the 4-power, 5-power potential agreement. So, so that's the stage, okay? And the empire, this is the last thing. The British Empire and everything that's connected to it, the U.S. deep state, the State Department, etc. All of that, this is what they really fear. And as long as they can maintain a strategy of tension between the major nations, permanent irregular warfare with international terrorism, the drug trade, the international financial system, which is collapsing and bringing the world down. The U.S., which is a component of that empire in its current form, is collapsing as well in terms, because the empire is collapsing. But if the U.S. could extricate itself from that empire, it could develop. It could soar. It could develop. And that's essentially the issue with Trump. He has rejected the green agenda. He has rejected the imperial system of globalization. And the Chinese have not fully rejected that system, but they are prepared to do so once a clear alternative is put together. And that's where the issue of Donald Trump is do or die for the whole empire. It's not because of Donald Trump. It's because his inclinations are against those things. And this is nowhere better reflected than in the speech he gave in Mount Rushmore. And he made it very clear that the attacks on these monuments was an attack on the very idea of America. They're designed to destroy the very concept of America. And as I laid out, and as I laid out before in my previous presentation, Trump essentially laid out the same thing, that this is an attack on the history of the United States, and then he went after also the situation of political correctness and tyranny that's developed in the workplace, in the government workplaces, in the corporate workplaces, in the institutional workplaces, where if you don't have the right code words, you cannot say what you think. You'll get fired. You cannot be who you are. You have to genuflect and submit to beliefs that are being imposed, where you have to learn the right gender terms, and you have to learn the right this and the right that. And if you don't, you're out. It's a form of tyranny against the blue-collar population and against the working class and against the small business people, who are also the people that have been most hit by the virus, by the lockdown. And this is brutal. This is a brutal assault on the population to force them to submit to this kind of tyranny. And the Black Lives Matter is part of that. It's part of weaponizing that whole mentality that America is bad, and if you represent America, you're a racist and a fascist, and on and on and on. You're a supremacist, and it's the whole white dead European male narrative that's been promoted for more than several generations. Trump took that on in his speech. I've never seen that yet, him do that, and he made it very clear that the fight is to renew the founding principles of the United States, which are in Lincoln, in Martin Luther King, in Frederick Douglass. Okay, he made it very clear that this is an anti-slavery founding principle that was unique to America and that helped to liberate the world from these oppressions. So, and he kept referring to the Revolutionary War, and how Washington crossed the Delaware and how he led a force to stand up to the most powerful empire in the world. And by the implication of him saying is that this renewal that he is calling for is precisely metaphorically the same thing. It's standing up to this globalized empire, and that's implicit in the speech. That's actually explicit. And in the speech, he made it very clear that it's these founding principles which ended slavery throughout most of the world and ended and promoted an idea of actual freedom. Because prior to the American Revolution, there was no real place in the world where anybody was free. And that's why Lincoln made it very clear that the Civil War was not about slavery per se. It's about whether their world would be, whether anyone in the world would have a governmental system where there was freedom. And this was made very clear by Trump. So this is definitely a step up in terms, and the media has gone absolutely berserk on this. The media have gone on. But again, this is the FDR reflex. This is where you're going to have to restore the policies of FDR. But to restore the policies of FDR, you also have to restore the continuity of the national identity, of the actual national identity on which those policies have to be based. They're not arbitrary. They have to come from a higher level, and that higher level is the actual true history of the United States, not the dead white European male version. And so this was in Trump. He even went so far as to quote the very powerful last stanza of the battle hymn of the Republic, which ends, as he died across the sea, let us die to make men free. God is marching on. So he's invoking the fight against slavery, which is the fight today against this neoliberal tyranny, which is unleashing this chaos in the streets and so forth and so on, which has been brainwashing the youth for decades, but which began in earnest with the period that Lynn saw with the 60s, 60s anti-war movement and the youth rebellion, where the new ideas, the anti-American seed was planted there. And it's precisely Lyndon LaRouche's intervention into that milieu to recruit some of the best of the young people that has made it possible for Lyndon LaRouche and those recruits and their successors to keep alive on a global scale, to keep alive domestically, the FDR idea in the Democratic Party. In the Democratic Party, and if you were talking about FDR in the period of the Bush administration or the Obama administration, you were immediately labeled a LaRouche, because only the LaRouche organizers, the LaRouche activists, the LaRouche associates were actually going into the Democratic Party and talking about FDR. And we did this very popular 1932 DVD and the Firewall DVD in 2008 that impacted greatly the whole fight for the Glass-Steagall that got derailed by the Obama and Occupy Wall Street, which was a total derailment of the motion that was going on in the United States in the middle of that financial crisis. So that's what the FDR reflex is all about, and the higher reflex of that, a higher basis of that, is the refounding of the underlying principles that are embedded in the Declaration of the Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and are endowed by their Creator with unalienable rights. Among those, the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And that's really what was being revived in this crisis. And that's why the media has gone totally berserk. But in that is the FDR reflex. And I hope that people who watch this get that sense that we are entering this very tumultuous last months of the presidential campaign. And that's going to be the issue. Or I should say, that should be the issue. The issue of what this nation really is. And the issue of the kind of policies, infrastructure and economic policies that FDR represents. But those cannot be, those have to be connected. And that's what we have to do. And that's exactly what the media and Wall Street and the City of London are going to try to prevent from happening.